The casket was white. That was the first thing Caliph Rowan noticed when he walked through the cathedral doors. Not the candles, not the flowers, not the 200 people sitting inside in silk and expensive cologne. The casket was white, and nobody in that building was crying. Caliph stood beside it anyway, alone. His borrowed black suit pulled tight across his shoulders, the seams threatening to split every time he breathed too deep. The collar was too stiff. The shoes were too small. He could feel the crowd watching him already, the way their eyes moved across him slowly, the way their conversations didn't stop, just lowered to that particular pitch that meant they were talking about him specifically. He kept his eyes on Seravin's face. Seravin Hallbrook had been beautiful, even in death. High cheekbones, smooth dark skin, the kind of stillness that looked almost like peace. The Omega heir of the Hallbrook family. Brilliant, calculated, trained since childhood to carry weight that would have broken most people. Caliph had loved him, not the way people assumed, not with envy or bitterness. Just the plain, simple way you love someone who was once kind to you when they had no reason to be. He pressed his fingers against the edge of the casket. Didn't speak. Behind him, the cathedral filled with the sound of money. Whispered conversations about contracts, about territory, about who would move where now that the Hallbrook heir was gone. A woman in a fur stole leaned toward the man beside her and said, without bothering to lower her voice at all, "They brought the cousin, the chubby one. Can you imagine?" Caliph's jaw tightened. He didn't turn around. Hi viewers. Have you ever stood in a room full of people and still felt completely invisible? Drop a yes or no in the comments. I want to know. He'd been standing there for 11 minutes when the cathedral went quiet. Not a polite quiet. Not a respectful, the service is starting quiet. This was the kind of silence that falls when something dangerous enters a room. The doors at the far end of the cathedral swung open. Both of them, at the same time, like they'd been pushed from the outside with one unified motion. 3 men walked in. Identical. Every detail. The jaw, the height, the width of their shoulders, the slow and deliberate way they moved. They wore black suits that had clearly been made for them, not borrowed, not rented. The kind of black that absorbs light. And the crowd parted for them without being asked. Chairs scraping, bodies shifting. An entire cathedral of mafia elite pressing themselves back like the floor itself had tilted. Dven Core, Bayless Core, Kyrian Core, the Triplet Alpha Kings. Caliph had heard stories. Everyone had. The kind of stories that got quieter when children walked into the room. 3 brothers who had dismantled 4 rival syndicates in a single year. Who had redrawn territory lines across 6 states without a single public announcement. Whose name alone was enough to make grown men suddenly remember previous engagements. They walked in a loose formation, driven slightly ahead. Not rushing. Not performing. Just moving through the space the way people move when they have never once had to wonder whether they belong somewhere. The 200 people in that cathedral stopped whispering. Completely. Caliph kept his eyes on Seravin. He heard their footsteps crossing the marble floor. Getting closer. Then stopping. He didn't look up. He wasn't sure why. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he just didn't want to give the room another thing to watch him react to. But then he felt it. A weight. Not physical. Not a hand on his shoulder or a body stepping into his space. Something else. The specific, uncomfortable sensation of being watched by someone who is not looking away. He turned his head slowly. Dven Core had stopped walking 6 feet from the front pew. His brothers stood behind him. Both of them scanning the room the way security scans a perimeter. Professional, efficient, disinterested. Dven wasn't scanning anything. His eyes were on Caliph. Not on the casket. Not on the assembled elite of 3 syndicates. On Caliph specifically. Still. Fixed. With an expression that didn't read as curiosity or contempt or pity. Just attention. Pure, unbroken attention, the kind a person gives something they are deciding about. Calith's breath caught somewhere in his chest. He was standing beside the casket of the man the entire room believed should have been there instead of him. He was wearing a suit that didn't fit, in shoes that hurt, surrounded by people who had made it very clear over the last 72 hours exactly what they thought of him. And the most dangerous alpha in the country was looking at him like he was the only person in the room worth seeing. Calith's heart did something it had no business doing. It went cold. 3 days. That was all it took for the Hallbrook Council to make their decision. 3 days after they buried Seravan. 3 days after the last mourner filed out of the cathedral and the last wreath was removed from the front steps. 3 days, and the council called Calith into the East Room like he was being summoned to hear a verdict. He sat across from 4 men who did not look at him like a person. Elder Aldous Hallbrook, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, slid a document across the table without preamble. No greeting, no offer of water. Just paper, pushed in his direction, and 4 sets of eyes waiting to see if he would argue. Calith looked down. He read the first line. Then he read it again. A binding Omega marriage agreement. His name where Seravan's used to be. And beside it, underlined the name of the groom. Dven Core. The room didn't move. Calith kept his eyes on the page because if he lifted them, he knew what he would see. Satisfaction on Aldous' face. The kind of satisfaction that comes not from cruelty exactly, but from efficiency. From solving a problem with the materials you have available. The contract was always political, Aldous said. His voice the flat tone of someone explaining something obvious to someone slow. Seravan was the intended party. Seravan is gone. The Core family has agreed to honor the original terms under one condition. Calith finally looked up. What condition? That the replacement Omega be a blood relative of the Hallbrook line. Aldous folded his hands. You qualify. Just like that. He qualified. Not chosen. Not asked. Not considered as a human being with preferences or fears or a single opinion that mattered to anyone in that room. He qualified. Like a form filled out correctly. Like a box checked off a list. He signed the document. What else was there to do? The Taylors arrived the next morning. Words like replacement and obligation and poor thing, but not the kind of poor thing that meant sympathy. The kind that meant what a mess. Calith stood in the center of the room with his arms held out and stared at the wall. He thought about Seravan. About how different this would have looked if it had been him standing here. How the Taylors would have worked quickly and carefully. How the servants would have whispered with excitement instead of pity. How the entire machinery of the Hallbrook family would have moved around him like a river bends around stone. Calith was not stone. He was something they had picked up off the ground because they needed something to fill a space. One of the Taylors, older than the rest, with hands that moved slow and sure, stepped in front of him and adjusted the collar of the fitting jacket. She looked up at his face. For a moment she just studied him. Then she said, very quietly, almost under her breath, "You deserve kindness. Not you look nice or this will fit well or any of the professional pleasantries the others were exchanging. Just that. Plain and small and said like she meant it." Calith almost laughed. Not from humor. From something that had nowhere else to go. He pressed his lips together and looked back at the wall. And the old seamstress went back to her pins, and no one else in the room said anything real for the rest of the afternoon. That night, Calith sat on the edge of his bed in the dark. He didn't turn on the lights. He thought about what was coming. The wedding. The man. The cathedral full of people who would watch him walk down that aisle and measure every inch of him against what they'd lost. He thought about Dven Core's eyes at the funeral. The way they had not moved. He didn't hear footsteps. No guards announced anything. No knock. The door simply opened. Calith looked up. Dven Core stood in the doorway, framed by the low light from the hallway. Still, watching him exactly the way he had watched him across the cathedral floor. Just standing there. like he'd been there before. Dven didn't move for a long moment. He stood in the doorway and looked at Caliph the way a person looks at something they've been thinking about. Not with hunger, not with calculation, but with the specific patience of someone who has already decided to pay attention and is now simply doing it. Then he stepped inside, closed the door behind him, pulled the chair from the corner of the room, set it a careful distance from the bed, and sat down like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Caliph hadn't moved. He was still sitting on the edge of the bed in the dark, still in his day clothes, hands folded in his lap. He watched Dven sit and didn't say anything because he genuinely didn't know what to say. No one had taught him what to do when the most dangerous man alive let himself into your room and took a seat. Dven looked at him. "What do you want from this marriage?" That was the first thing he said. Not hello. Not I've reviewed the contract. Not I have expectations. Just that, plain and direct, like the answer actually mattered to him. Caliph stared. "I don't think what I want matters," he said. It wasn't bitterness. He wasn't performing resignation. He was just saying the truest thing he knew. The thing 3 days of paperwork and 4 tailors and a hallway full of whispering servants had made very clear. Dven's expression didn't change exactly, but something in it shifted. Something around the eyes. "Who told you that?" "Nobody had to tell me." Caliph looked down at his hands. "It's just how things work." Silence. Not uncomfortable. More like the kind of silence that happens when someone is actually thinking about what you said instead of waiting for their turn to speak. "You were crying at the funeral," Dven said. Caliph looked up sharply. "The others weren't," Dven continued. "They were calculating. You were crying." He said it without judgment. Just observation. The tone of a man noting a fact that interested him. Caliph didn't know what to do with that. "He was my cousin," he said finally. "I know." He was also the only person in that family who ever said anything decent to me. He hadn't meant to say that part. Came out anyway. Dven looked at him for a long moment. "What did he say?" Caliph almost didn't answer. Then, "He told me kind people survive longer than cruel ones." Something moved through Dven's face. Quick and quiet, gone before it fully formed. But it had been there. Something that looked, for just a fraction of a second, like it meant something to him. He leaned back in the chair, crossed one leg over the other. His presence in the room was enormous. Not loud, not aggressive, just dense, like the air around him had more weight. "The council presented this arrangement to me as a correction," Dven said. "A logistical adjustment. I know what they called it. I'm not asking you to accept that framing." Caliph went still. "Then what are you asking?" Dven studied him, took his time with it. "Nothing yet," he said. The room sat quiet again. Outside, somewhere far down the hall, a door closed. The candles on the nightstand flickered once. Then Dven said, like it had just occurred to him, like it was almost casual, "Has anyone here ever protected you?" The question landed different than Caliph expected. He thought about answering quickly. He thought about deflecting. But the question was so direct and so specific and so strange that he just sat there with it, turning it over, feeling the edges of it. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Dven stood, straightened his jacket, moved back toward the door without hurry, the way he did everything. Like time was something he had made arrangements with. He paused at the door, didn't turn all the way around. Maybe they should have. He left. The door clicked shut behind him. Caliph sat in the dark for a long time after that. His chest was doing something he couldn't name. Not warmth exactly. Not relief. Something more fragile than either of those. Something he was almost afraid to look at directly. It started with books. Dven came back the next afternoon. Didn't announce himself, didn't send anyone ahead. Just appeared in the doorway of the small sitting room off Caliph's bedroom. holding a worn copy of something old enough that the spine had started to separate. He set it on the table between them. "You read?" he asked. Caliph looked at the book, then at Dven. "Yes. This one's strange. I'd like to know what you think of it." That was it. That was the invitation. No ceremony. No pressure. Dven sat down across from him, and the afternoon passed in the kind of quiet that didn't ask anything of either of them. He came back the day after that. And the day after that. No guards stood at the door. No council members hovered nearby to monitor what was being said. No one from the Holbrook family came to observe and report back. It was just the two of them, and whatever conversation found its way into the space between them. They talked about rain once. Genuinely talked about it. Dven said he'd grown up somewhere that flooded every spring. That the smell of water on dry ground was one of the only things from his childhood he actually liked. Caliph said he used to sit by the kitchen window during storms and watch the gutters fill up and feel like the world was being cleaned. Dven looked at him after that. Not like he was analyzing it. Like he was putting it somewhere to keep. They talked about food Caliph's grandmother had made when he was small. They talked about a book Dven had read in 3 languages and liked differently in each one. They talked about what people dreamed about when they stopped believing their dreams were possible. Not because either of them brought it up directly, but because the conversation bent that way on its own and neither of them turned it around. Caliph had not talked like this in years. Not since Saravan. And even then, Saravan had been more of a listener. Kind, present, but always slightly somewhere else. Dven listened differently. He listened like he was gathering something. Like whatever Caliph said was going somewhere inside him that mattered. It was strange. It was the strangest thing that had ever happened to Caliph. And then one afternoon Dven said something deadpan about a book character making the worst possible decision with complete confidence. And Caliph laughed. Actually laughed. Not a polite sound. Not the careful, contained kind of laugh he'd trained himself to make in rooms where he wasn't sure if he was welcome. A real one. Unexpected, a little too loud. The kind that made him press his hand over his mouth after. He looked up. Dven was watching him. Not smiling. Not laughing with him. Just watching. With an expression Caliph couldn't fully read. Something concentrated. Something that held very still. Like he was witnessing something he hadn't expected and didn't want to interrupt. Caliph dropped his hand from his mouth. "Sorry," he said automatically. "Don't be," Dven said. His voice was very quiet. The afternoon light came through the window at a low angle. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Caliph noticed something. He'd been noticing it gradually, the way you notice things that accumulate slowly before they suddenly become obvious. The servant who had called him the wrong name on purpose every morning for a week. Gone. The woman who used to pass his doorway and pause just long enough to look at him like he was something unfortunate, no longer appearing in the hall. 3 separate people who had made the weeks leading up to this arrangement actively humiliating for him. All quietly disappeared. Not fired. Not confronted in any way he'd witnessed. Just gone. He didn't ask Dven about it. He wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. But he noticed. He noticed. And then winter shifted in the walls of the house. The visits had found a rhythm. A pace Caliph's days had started to organize themselves around without him deciding to let that happen. He didn't tell himself it meant anything. He just knew that the hour before Dven usually arrived was the hour he was most awake. One morning he came to the sitting room at the regular time. The room was empty. He waited. An hour passed. Then another. Dven didn't come. Caliph told himself it was nothing. One missed afternoon. It happened. People had business. The Core family ran operations across 6 states. One afternoon didn't mean anything. The next day, the room was empty again. 3 weeks. No message. No word sent through the council. No explanation delivered by a servant. No letter slid under the door or name spoken in his direction by anyone connected to the Core household. Just absence. Complete and total and loud in the way that only silence can be loud. The rumors moved faster than information in a house like this. Faster than truth, faster than fact, faster than anyone bothered to check. They came to Caliph in pieces the way bad news always arrives. Fragments through cracked doors. Words caught at the edge of a hallway. A servant who wasn't careful enough about how much her voice carried. Dven had left the country. The Core family was reconsidering the arrangement. There was talk of embarrassment. There was talk of cancellation. Caliph sat with those words for a long time. He sat with them in the sitting room that had stopped being visited. In the chair he'd started to think of as his, across from the one he'd started to think of as Dven's. He sat with them in the morning and he sat with them at night, and he told himself with total seriousness that this didn't matter to him. He was good at telling himself things. He'd had years of practice. The Hallbrook Council grew visibly anxious in a way that had nothing to do with Caliph's feelings and everything to do with the political fallout of a Core contract going sideways. Elder Aldous paced the corridors. Closed-door meetings happened 3 times a day. Voices raised behind walls that were supposed to be soundproof. Caliph moved through all of it like a ghost. He didn't participate, wasn't invited to. He was still, technically, the central figure in all of this, the omega in the contract, the name on the document, the body the arrangement required. But no one came to tell him anything. No one explained the next steps or the contingency plans or what happened to him if the deal collapsed entirely. He ate dinner alone. He read. He watched the rain come in from the east on a Tuesday night and thought about a conversation that was never going to happen again. About water on dry ground and the smell of something being cleaned. That matters. It had mattered. That was the part he kept running into. He could manage disappointment. He'd built his whole life out of managing disappointment, of lowering expectations in advance so the fall was shorter. He knew how to not want things. He'd been doing it since childhood. What he didn't know how to manage was the specific, quiet grief of something that had actually been good. It hadn't been a grand gesture. It hadn't been romance in any shape he could have pointed to and named. It had been someone sitting across from him and listening. Someone who asked what he thought and then waited for the real answer. Someone who removed the people who had been hurting him without making him watch it happen, which was its own particular kind of consideration. He hadn't expected it to matter. It mattered. Sometimes the cruelest pain isn't betrayal. It's the moment you realize kindness mattered to you. That you let yourself believe in it. That you started planning your days around it without noticing. And then it's gone and you're standing in the evidence of how much you'd begun to count on it. Caliph folded that understanding away. Somewhere deep. Somewhere he didn't have to look at it directly to carry it. The council met again the following morning. This time they sent for him. He walked into the East Room expecting to hear that the contract had been voided. That he would be returned to whatever his life had been before. The background figure, the overlooked one, the chubby cousin nobody planned anything around. He sat down. Aldous didn't look comfortable. None of them did. The situation requires an immediate decision, Aldous said. His voice was tight. The Core family has not formally withdrawn. The contract remains technically active. We've determined that waiting further creates more risk than moving forward. Caliph looked at him. We are proceeding with the ceremony, Aldous said, this week, before any additional complications arise. Without Dven? Aldous met his eyes for exactly 1 second. The groom's presence at the ceremony is a procedural consideration, not a contractual requirement. The room went very quiet. Caliph understood what he was hearing. They were going to marry him off, even if Dven wasn't there. Even if the man who had sat across from him and asked what he wanted had vanished without a word and left no indication he intended to return. Even then, They were pushing the ceremony through like a document being filed before a deadline, and no one in this room was going to ask Caliph what he thought about any of it. He looked at his hands. He thought about the old seamstress who had told him he deserved kindness. He thought about how he had almost laughed. The cathedral was full again. Same marble floors. Same stained glass throwing colored light across the pews. Same 200 people in the same expensive clothes, sitting in the same careful formations that had nothing to do with where they wanted to sit and everything to do with who they needed to be seen near. Different reason this time. This was supposed to be a wedding. Caliph stood at the back of the nave in the white Omega ceremonial suit the seamstress had finished 3 days ago. It fit better than the borrowed black suit had. That was the only thing he could say about how he felt wearing it. The crowd was restless. He could feel it before he even started down the aisle, a current running through the assembled guests, something low and charged that had nothing to do with celebration. People kept glancing toward the front of the cathedral and then back at the doors. Conversations that cut off too fast when someone walked near. Eyes that moved the wrong way, toward each other instead of toward him. Something was wrong. He walked anyway. Because what else do you do when the council has told you to walk and the doors are behind you and the only person who might have changed this hadn't bothered to come back? He made it halfway down the aisle. Then a man stood up. Not from the Holbrook section. Not from the Core family's reserved pews. From the left side near the back. A section that Caliph didn't recognize. Filled with faces he hadn't seen at the funeral. The man was broad-shouldered and wore a gray suit and held a folder in one hand like he'd been waiting specifically for this moment. Specifically for this halfway point. "Stop the ceremony," he said. His voice carried. Designed to carry. The cathedral went dead quiet. The man opened the folder. "We are representatives of the Voss Syndicate," he said, moving his eyes across the assembled crowd with the practiced ease of someone making a presentation they had rehearsed. "We are here today to present documented evidence that the death of Servan Holbrook was not natural." He paused, exactly long enough, and that the Omega now standing at the altar was involved in arranging it. The silence broke, not all at once, in pieces. First one murmur, then three, then the whole cathedral coming alive with sound. Heads turning, hands moving to phones and jacket lapels and the ears of the person seated nearest. The sound of 200 people calculating at the same time. Caliph stopped walking. His legs just stopped. He was standing in the center of the aisle in a white suit with 200 eyes turning toward him and a man in gray reading from a folder. And the floor beneath him felt like it had shifted 3 inches to the left without moving at all. "The documents include communications," the man in gray continued, louder now, riding the noise rather than fighting it. "Between the Omega Caliph Rowan and a known contractor, dated 6 weeks before Servan Holbrook's death. We are requesting that this ceremony be halted pending a full investigation." The Holbrook elder section did not stand up. Caliph looked at them. Aldous Holbrook sat very still with his hands folded on his lap and his eyes forward, like a man who had made a decision earlier in the day that he was not going to revisit. They weren't going to say anything. Not one of them. 2 guards appeared from the side doors. Not cathedral staff. Not Holbrook men. Voss Syndicate, moving with the efficiency of people who had been placed there well before the ceremony started. They walked toward Caliph. From behind him, near the back pews, someone shouted it. Raw and ugly and loud enough that the word bounced off the ceiling and came back down. "Drag him outside." The guards reached him. One closed a hand around his left arm. Caliph did not fight. He didn't know how to fight. He knew how to stand still and absorb and keep his face from showing everything happening inside it, and that was what he did. He looked toward the front of the cathedral. The groom's side, empty. Dven Core wasn't there. He had known that already, had been told already, had spent 3 weeks telling himself it didn't mean what it felt like it meant. But standing in this aisle with a guard's hand on his arm and 200 people watching and a folder full of lies being read aloud in a house of God. Standing here in a suit that finally fit, he felt it land in his chest with a weight he had not been prepared for. Dven wasn't coming. They walked him to the front. Not outside. Not yet. The guard positioned him near the altar like a problem being set aside, and the man in gray kept reading, and the Hallbrook Council sat in their pew like furniture. Caliph stood there. He listened to the accusations, communications, contractors, dates and times and alleged meetings that he had never attended in places he had never been. The documents sounded real. They were supposed to sound real. Someone had worked on them. Someone had taken their time, building something careful and convincing out of the right words in the right order. He thought about speaking. He thought about turning to the crowd and saying that none of it was true, that he had loved Saravan, that the only thing he had done in the weeks before his cousin died was sit in his room and read and wait for meals and try not to take up too much space in a house that didn't want him in it. He didn't speak. Because here was the thing about rooms like this one. The crowd didn't want the truth. The crowd wanted a story that confirmed what they already believed. And what they already believed, what they had believed from the moment he walked through these doors at a funeral wearing a borrowed suit, was that Caliph Rowan was someone who things happened to. Not someone who mattered. Not someone to defend. He looked at the Hallbrook Council again. Aldous. The old man was looking at the floor now. Not at Caliph. Not at the man in gray. At the floor, like he was waiting for this specific scene to end so he could move on to whatever came after it. His own family. He had known, on some level, that the Hallbrook family had never been his family in any real sense. They had fed him and housed him and included his name on documents when it was useful and excluded him from every room that mattered. He had known that. But knowing something and feeling the full weight of it are two completely different things. He felt it now. The full weight. No one in this building was going to stand up for him. Not the Hallbrook Council. Not the guests who had watched him walk down this aisle. Not the servants who had whispered in hallways or the tailors who had measured him without speaking or anyone who had been in this room for any part of the last 3 weeks. The world rarely attacks the strong first. It attacks the ones no one will defend. And Caliph Rowan had never, in his entire life, been the kind of person anyone defended. He let his shoulders drop. Not in defeat exactly. In something more complete than defeat. An acceptance that moved through him like cold water, from his chest downward, settling, stilling, making everything inside him go very quiet. He was going to face this, alone, the way he had faced everything else. The man in gray finished reading. The cathedral murmured. One of the guards stepped closer, hand moving toward Caliph's other arm. Then, the doors slammed open. Both of them. The sound cracked through the cathedral like something physical, like a change in air pressure, like the building itself had taken a breath. Every head turned. The guard stopped moving. The man in gray stopped talking. The cathedral went completely, absolutely silent. And in that silence, boots, slow, deliberate, crossing marble, getting louder. Dven Core walked through those doors like he owned the cathedral, the city, and every syndicate in the room. He wasn't alone. Behind him, moving in a formation so precise it looked rehearsed because were men. Not 10. Not 20. Enough to line both walls of the nave without crowding. Armed, still, watching the crowd with the flat professional calm of people who had already mapped every exit and already decided what happened if someone moved wrong. Valus came in on the left. Kyrian came in on the right. The three of them filled the space the way a storm fills a valley. Not with noise, not with spectacle, but with the simple, unmistakable fact of their presence. Dven walked down the aisle. Didn't rush. His eyes moved once across the left section, the Voss syndicate contingent, the man in gray, the guards who had been holding Caliph's arm and were now very clearly not holding it. And then his eyes moved to Caliph. He didn't look away after that. He walked the full length of the nave looking only at Caliph, and the crowd on either side pressed back into the pews like they were making room for something they did not want to be in the way of. He stopped in front of the man in gray, didn't look at him, looked through him. "You can sit down," Dven said. His voice was calm. That was the most frightening thing about it. The man in gray held his folder and did not sit down immediately, because his dignity required him to stand there for at least 3 more seconds. He stood there for 3 more seconds. Then he sat down. Dven turned to the crowd. "The documents presented today are fabricated." He said it the way someone says the sky is a particular color, plainly without argument, as if he had simply decided the debate was over. The Voss Syndicate created them 6 weeks ago, shortly after Dven Hallbrook's death, when they realized the Dven Core alliance would close a territory gap they have been exploiting for 4 years. Silence. The original communications have been recovered. The contractor named in the documents has been located. His statement and 3 sets of corroborating financial records connecting the Voss Syndicate to Dven's death are currently in the possession of 2 independent arbiters and 1 federal contact. The man in gray's face changed. Several other faces in the Voss section changed. "This matters," Dven said, and for just a second something in his voice shifted. Not loud, not dramatic, but different, weighted differently, not because of politics, not because of territory, because the person they chose to frame was someone who had nothing to do with any of it. He turned from the crowd. He walked to Caliph, stopped directly in front of him. Caliph hadn't moved. He was still standing where the guards had left him, in his white suit, in the middle of the altar space, with every person in the cathedral watching both of them. Dven looked at him. Up close, there was something in his face that hadn't been there in the sitting room. Something that had been controlled before, managed, kept behind a surface that didn't show edges. It was showing edges now. He reached up. His hand, careful, deliberate, lifted Caliph's chin. Not forceful. Not commanding in the way a performance is commanding. Careful. Like something he had thought about. "He belongs to me," Dven said. "To the room. To every syndicate represented in every pew. To the Hallbrook Council who had not moved. To the man in gray. To the guards. To anyone in that building who had decided over the last hour, over the last 3 weeks, over the last several years that Caliph Rowan was something you could use and discard." The cathedral froze. 200 people and not one of them made a sound. Caliph looked up at him. His throat was tight. "You disappeared," he said. His voice came out low. Not accusing. Not broken. Just the plainest possible statement of the plainest possible fact. Dven held his gaze. Didn't look away. "I was preparing a war." The cathedral began to breathe again. Slowly, carefully, like a room that wasn't sure it had permission yet. The Voss contingent was escorted out by Kyrion's men with the brisk efficiency of people who understood that their leverage had just been removed and their continued presence was not going to improve their situation. The man in gray walked out with his folder still in his hand, and the folder felt, by that point, like something embarrassing to be holding. The Hallbrook Council stood, all 4 of them at the same time with the synchronized movement of men who had just recalculated everything. Dven ignored them. He guided Caliph, not dragging, not steering, just a hand at his shoulder blade, steady, to a small room off the side of the altar. Closed the door. The noise of the cathedral dropped to a murmur through the wall. The room had 2 chairs and a window and nothing else. Caliph sat. His legs needed it. Dven stood near the window, looking out at something Caliph couldn't see from where he was sitting. For a moment neither of them said anything, and Caliph used that moment to do the thing he'd been refusing to do for the last hour: breathe. Really breathe. Let his hands stop gripping each other in his lap. Let his jaw unclench. Dven's death wasn't accidental, Dven said. He said it to the window. I suspected it at the funeral. The circumstances didn't add up the way they were supposed to. The Voss Syndicate had motive. They'd been operating in Hallbrook territory for 2 years under a false partnership agreement that Saravan had recently discovered. He turned from the window. I needed time. Evidence doesn't appear because you want it to. It has to be found, confirmed, and placed somewhere it can't be touched. Caliph looked at him. That's why you left. I had to move without drawing attention. If I'd announced an investigation, the evidence would have been destroyed inside of 48 hours. He held Caliph's gaze. I delayed the ceremony to protect you from standing in that cathedral without a defense prepared. Caliph sat with that. It moved through him differently than he expected. Not like relief exactly. Not like joy. More like something that had been braced and tight for 3 weeks, slowly, carefully, letting go. You could have told me, he said. Yes. No hesitation. I should have. That was it. No explanation built around it. No justification layered over it. Just the plain admission, given with the same directness he gave everything. Caliph felt something shift behind his eyes. He hadn't cried yet. Not through the accusations. Not through the guard's hand on his arm. Not through standing at the altar alone while 200 people watched someone read a folder full of lies about him. He cried now. Not loudly. Not with drama. Just his face doing the thing faces do when there is nothing left to hold against. Eyes going warm, throat going tight, and the tears coming quiet and steady because the thing he had been bracing against for 3 weeks had turned out to be the opposite of what he feared. Dven crossed the room. He sat beside him. Not across from him. Beside him. Close enough that Caliph could feel the weight of him on the same bench. He didn't say anything. He didn't try to stop the crying or redirect it or make it into something more comfortable for the room. He just stayed there, present and still, one hand resting near Caliph's on the bench without quite touching it, like an offer being made without pressure. Caliph didn't know how long it lasted. Eventually the tears slowed. He pressed the back of his hand against his face. Outside the door, through the wall, he heard the cathedral beginning to move. Chairs, voices, the quiet, organized sounds of 200 people who had witnessed something and were now processing what it meant for them. Someone's voice, low, carried through the stone. The Alpha King chose him. 3 words, said with something that wasn't quite disbelief and wasn't quite awe and sat right in between. Caliph looked down at his hands. He thought about everything he had not allowed himself to want over the last several weeks. Every conversation in the sitting room that he had refused to let mean too much. Every moment he had stored carefully and then told himself was ordinary, manageable, fine. He looked up at Dven. The question had been sitting in him for a long time. Long before today. Since the first night Dven had sat in the corner of his dark bedroom and asked what he wanted and actually waited for the answer. He asked it. Why me? Dven didn't answer immediately. He looked at Caliph. Really looked at him the way he always looked at him, like whatever he was seeing was something worth the time it took to see it properly. Then he said, at the funeral. Caliph waited. Every person in that cathedral was working, Dven said, calculating, moving pieces in their heads. Saravan wasn't even cold yet, and they were already rearranging the board. He was quiet for a second. I watched that room for 2 hours. I do that. It's useful. He turned to face Caliph directly. You were the only person crying. Caliph didn't move. Not performing grief. Not making yourself visible for the right people. Actually crying. Quietly. With your hand on the casket. Dven's voice stayed even, but there was something underneath it. Something careful and real. The kind of thing people say when they have thought about it for a long time before saying it out loud. You were sad. In a room full of people doing math. You were just sad. Caliph looked at him. I noticed, Dven said. I noticed things. That's how I've survived this long. And I noticed that, in a world that rewards people who don't feel things, you still felt them. Openly. Without strategy. He paused. Kindness is rarer than power. The room held that. Outside the window, rain had started coming down. Not heavy. The kind of rain that falls like it's been there for a while already, like it started before you noticed. Quiet and steady against the stone. Caliph thought about the things he had been called over the years. Soft. Too much. Not enough. The cousin. The chubby one. The omega they brought because he qualified. He thought about how deeply he had believed all of it. How thoroughly he had folded those words into his understanding of himself. Smoothed them in. Built his daily life around the architecture they made. And then he thought about a worn book set on a table without ceremony. About rain on dry ground. About laughter he hadn't been able to stop and hadn't wanted to. About the fact that someone had quietly removed every person who had hurt him from the spaces he moved through, without making him watch. About a man who had gone to prepare a defense before there was even an attack. He stood up. The white suit still fit. He walked out of the side room first. The cathedral was quieter now. Some of the guests had left. The ones who remained had rearranged themselves. Pulled toward the center, toward the altar, toward the kind of witnessing that happens when people sense something worth watching. The Hallbrook Council stood near the front. Aldous looked at Caliph with an expression that had shifted considerably from 3 hours ago. Caliph didn't stop to read it. He walked to the center of the nave. He turned around. Dven was standing at the top of the aisle. Not as an entrance this time. Not as a statement. Just there, at the far end, watching Caliph with an expression that had stopped trying to be unreadable. No music started. No formal announcement was made. No elder came forward to direct the moment. Caliph started walking. His own pace. His own steps. Not because he had been told to, not because a contract required it, not because the Hallbrook family needed the alliance or the council had run out of other options. Because he wanted to. Dven met him halfway. They stood in the middle of the nave with the rain coming down outside and the remaining guests watching and no one in that cathedral saying a single word. Dven took his hand. Not a performance. Not possession. Just his hand, held in someone else's. In a room full of people who had spent years deciding what Caliph Rowan was worth. They had been wrong. They called him weak for years. The chubby cousin. The soft one. The omega nobody planned anything around. But sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is remain kind in a world that rewards cruelty, and be found, eventually, by someone who knows the difference. This story is finished. If something in Caliph's story connected with you, that quiet kind of pain nobody talks about, feeling invisible in rooms full of people or just finally being chosen, drop a comment below. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about people who survive, who get chosen, who prove everyone wrong in the quietest and most powerful ways, subscribe to this channel and turn on your notifications. We put out new stories regularly, and you don't want to miss what's coming next.